Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I'm unemployed, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink now, shall we? Today's ink is going to be Sheaffer Skrip RED. Very basic, found everywhere. And a longtime favorite because this is such a red ink. I mean, it is what you think of when you think of red, just simple red, not maroon red, not crazy shading red, not dark red, not red brown, red. Now, I did a little chromatography on it, which I learned from Michael Madsen of YouTube. You should check out his stuff. And as you can see, it is not a very water-resistant ink. I put the drop of ink right about there, and damn near all of it was pushed all the way up. But as you can see, there's a very consistent color. It's the same sort of all the way across. There's not a lot of variation. And that's actually one of the strengths of this red that I think really makes it extraordinary in its simplicity. It's exactly the kind of red that gave you nightmares when you were in school. Okay, so I did two tests. The first one is on Tomoe River paper. And the pens I used were a Knox Aristotle in extra fine and a Plato in medium, also by Knox, and a Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. Now, as you may or may not be able to see, this red really doesn't change. It's the same consistency from extra fine to medium to stub. There's not a lot of variation. There's not a lot of change depending on wetness because this runs a little drier because it's a stub. This medium runs wet, and this one, the extra fine, for an extra fine, it runs a little on the wet side, and yet still these are all the same red. All the same. And here you really don't see much shading. This is some swirlies and a little bit of flex. Again, not a whole lot of difference. So the flow was good. I said it might have been slightly wet, but I think that's because most of those pens were wet. There was no specified lubrication, so it ran wet and wet pens, it ran dry and dry pens. Shading, I gave it 2 out of 10, just because you do get a tiny bit, as you see in the sort of swab here. You can get a little bit of lightness, and you can get, but for the most part, you're just going to get the same consistent red. And so I had to give it some points for that, because honestly, I don't want to give this ink a bad review, honestly, because this is my go-to red. This is an old favorite of mine. It's probably the first red ink I ever bought myself, and it's an ink that I still buy because it's fantastic. Now, there was no spread, no feathering. It performed beautifully. There was no bleed through. There was no smear when dry, which you do sometimes get with red inks, particularly ones that have sheen. So this is an ink where you won't have to worry about that. Dry time was not fabulous, but for Tomoe River, I actually think it was pretty good. In the stub, you get nearly 10 seconds. In the extra fine, you get it by 15. And the medium, which again runs fairly wet, by 15, you're nearly there, which, you know, okay, I admit I'm going a little easy on this one, but still. So the show through, I thought, was really what's impressive about this. Now that's Sharpie up there, so just ignore that. But so against this white background, unless you are super picky, that is not going to bother you, especially if you write lighter like this. If you write super heavy, or if you write really dark, or if you write really broad, then maybe it would start to bother you, but for me, I would not hesitate. This, I mean, look at this. This is the printer. This is what came out on the printer. That you can almost read. This you can't. Another reason why I love this ink. On thin paper, it's fantastic if you want to be economical and use both sides of the paper. So, here we go. Now, this is a solid, simple red ink. It's almost like a ketchup-y red, but it's not No, actually it is Catch Me Red because it has that flatness to it. But here I compared it to Noodler's Nikita, J. Herbon's Rose Scented Rouge, Noodler's Red Eel, Diamine's Red Dragon, which a lot of people consider to be a very simple red, but when you compare it to Sheaffer, you realize that it actually is a bit on the dark side. The dark side. Speaking of the dark side, here it is compared to Diamine Oxblood. You start to really realize how dark that is. So, water resistance. Again, as we saw in the chromatography, not that great. However, there's a little something left there. So let's say you were using this to grade someone's papers and they tried to wash it off. You're going to know something was there. You might not be able to read it, but you'll know that something was there and they tried to get rid of it. Now, the next test was on Clairefontaine paper. And for this, I used 5 different pens. Same 3, but I also added a Galileo Binox in fine and an Avicenna Binox in broad. So the dry times are actually pretty good for such a hydrophobic, dense paper, because this is 90 grams per square meter. And yeah, ignore that. Here in the fine, which you didn't see before, even still, this runs pretty wet when it feels like it, and this time it felt like it. 10, it's nearly dry. 12, dry. Medium, which as you might have seen on the Tomoe River paper or in a previous test, that does run wet, and yet in 13 seconds, dry. The broad, which definitely runs wet, as you can tell by that huge smear right there at 0. 16 seconds, dry. This one can run dry, my Lamy Safari with the stub nib, because stubs I find often do run a bit dry. But here, 11 seconds, dry. I mean, here you can see in the 10, there's barely movement there. Now, I feel like Tomoe River paper, although it does bring out sheen really well, I feel like sometimes it's not always the best at showing depth of potential shading. Here you see a little bit more of it. Here's one quick swab. Here's a bit more of a rubby swab. And here, that's like when it's fresh out of the ink and I start scrubbing. So it's really heavy. You can see that you can get a little bit of shading out of this. It has to be in the sort of right conditions, but it's there. It's subtle, but it's there. And again, even on this paper, it was kind of a water massacre. But people seem to forget that inks that are water soluble are actually much easier to clean out of your pen. And so in those situations where you want an ink that's a little more permanent, that's great. They definitely have their uses, but for everyday stuff, when you're not so worried about is it going to wash off in the rain, water-soluble inks are actually a lot gentler on your pen and its parts. And Sheaffer Skrip RED definitely falls under that category. This is my go-to red. I love it. It's simple. It comes in cartridges, which if you travel a great deal like I do, is a godsend, because you do not want to be carrying a bunch of these around in a backpack. Trust me, you really don't want to be carrying around a bunch of those in a backpack. The stories I could tell. Anyways, great red, love it, definitely a thumbs up, highly recommend it, Sheaffer Skrip RED. Go out and get you some. So here's a goodbye from the Triple N Network. Hope you have a good day.